I was also 37 when I went into perimenopause, and I was fully postmenopausal by 45, essentially. I wasn't expecting perimenopause at 37.
Bite Back with Abbey Sharp is proudly sponsored by TENA Sensitive Care Incontinence Pads for Women. 77% of women with bladder weakness experience skin irritation while wearing incontinence protection. TENA Sensitive Care Pads are enriched with skin comfort formula to help protect intimate skin from irritation while providing triple protection against leaks, odor, and moisture. Sleep tight, wake up bright with TENA Sensitive Care Pads. Learn more at tena.ca. TENA.ca. Hi, Jen. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to learn from you.
Thanks, Abby. I'm really excited to be here.
No joke. In preparation for this interview, I went down a perimenopause rabbit hole. I want to talk about the waking. I grew up in the toxic 2000s, and I feel like I just always saw these women's magazines in my grandmother's house about the menobelly and, how to lose weight in menopause. That's basically the entire narrative of what I was taught when it comes to what to expect at this stage of life. Can you explain what's actually going on and what people can expect?
Yeah. And, weight gain is a symptom that I think takes people by surprise, even though it's all over the media, because we tend to think of it as something that we have 100% control over,
Yes.
right? Because that is the narrative that we've been given, that if you eat the right way and you move the right way and you do the right things, you can avoid it, you can prevent it, you can escape this dreaded, awful symptom. But a lot of the changes that are happening are changes that are programmed into our DNA. So we know from research that upwards of 90% of people will experience body changes, including weight gain. And on average, that's going to be between 5 and 20 pounds. So that's an average. That means that there's going to be some people who gain less and some people who gain more. So don't get fixed on the numbers, is what I tell people. Just know that the experience of your body changing is a normal thing that happens to almost everyone. But there's also this redistribution of assets that's happening, as I call it, because we have this shifting levels and declining levels of estrogen in particular. We tend to shift from this kind of gynoid or pear shape to more of an apple shape. And so even if you're not seeing changes on the scale, what you see in the mirror and how your clothes fit are definitely going to be changing. And that contributes to this syndrome of not feeling like myself.
Right.
Where you just kind of feel like you're having an out-of-body experience. And that's a really uncomfortable thing at any age, but it's especially uncomfortable when it's happening alongside all of these other symptoms. That all of a sudden your favorite jeans don't fit anymore, or you have to go up a size. And it feels like, because everyone is telling you, it's something that you should, quote unquote, be able to control. But as you and I both know, weight isn't a behavior. And that doesn't change with menopause.
Right. And it's no different during, pregnancy or postpartum. Like, you're watching your body change at what feels like a rapid pace compared to the rest of your life. And, seeing yourself in the mirror as a different person, it's very difficult for a lot of folks. So I really do empathize.
Yeah. And just to add a little bit to kind of the body changes, so we have these hormone changes that are happening, but we also have this age related, possibly menopause related change in muscle mass. So, decade over decade, we start to lose muscle and it becomes a little bit more challenging, but not impossible to build. We have to work a little bit harder at building and maintaining it, but there is kind of this age related decline. And there's also a change in just your daily activity levels. And so I have, almost 15 and 17-year-old kids. If I think back 13, 14 years ago, I had 3 kids under the age of 3 and I was running after toddlers all day long. Um, now I have teenagers who sit in their room all day and really just come out for food. So my daily kind of activity levels have changed significantly. And so this convergence of changes, some hormonal, some life, some age, may actually be changing our energy needs. And that's not to say that you have to count, measure, track, overanalyze, and try and control that. But I think just understanding that it's normal for human bodies to change as they get older and go through the lifespan because of all these things. And it's not something that you have done wrong. It's not something that you need to feel guilty for or feel shame around. A human body is a changing body.
That is so helpful. And I think just back to your point about, the fat redistribution and, basically just to give a little bit of background for folks who don't quite understand how that affects kind of everything else on the other hormones in the body. When we talk about the fat redistribution and the kind of apple shape, we're kind of talking about potentially an increase in that visceral fat. And, visceral fat is not just kind of like extra fluff, it can increase the risk of insulin resistance. And just to elaborate on that for a minute, there's a few mechanisms here at play. So for one, estrogen regulates the hormone adiponectin, which can help drive sugars into the muscle cells. So less estrogen means less adiponectin, which can increase sugars in the blood. And two, that extra visceral fat secretes inflammatory cytokines and also kind of physically gets in the way of kind of normal blood sugar signaling. And what's annoying, I guess, is that body weight and insulin resistance are bidirectionally related, where insulin resistance can increase visceral fat and visceral fat can further worsen insulin resistance.
And the other interesting thing about the visceral fat deposition, especially, is that it also produces a type of estrogen. So it produces estrone, and that is a type of estrogen. So one of the theories around possible benefits or reasons why this is happening is to give us that little bit of extra estrogen in postmenopause. So even though there definitely may be things that are happening metabolically as a result, there can also be maybe some side benefits that are impacting our long-term health in a positive way.
Naturally, when people think about all these things together that we've kind of just talked about, weight going up, insulin resistance, they assume that the solution is they need to go low carb or they need to go keto. Should people in menopause be going low carb, super, go keto, carnivore, whatever it is, to manage these kind of hormonal body changes?
Well, I mean, this is all based on the idea that carbs and the insulin response are somehow pathological and that something happens when you become, a midlifer, or if you're somebody who lives in a larger body, that you can't, quote unquote, process carbs
Right.
normally anymore. And as I'm sure your audience knows, that has been disproven many, many times. This carb insulin model of weight regulation is way oversimplified. And we need to recognize that carbohydrates are and always will be our body's
Mhm.
preferred fuel source. So when we cut carbs, what tends to happen is our energy levels drop, our mood can drop. It can make it harder to fall asleep and potentially stay asleep. And that's not something that we want to add to at this stage of life. And we don't need to. The other thing about carbohydrates is that they are a great source of different types of fiber, especially soluble fiber, which as we get into midlife and we start to try and navigate some of those increased risks to heart health and increasing cholesterol or trying to reduce the risks of certain cancers, we want easy, delicious, affordable, accessible ways to get that fiber in. And if you go keto, you're going to cut all
Right.
of those out. And that's not to say that you can't choose carbohydrates with some intention in mind. We can choose carbohydrates that happen to be higher in fiber or protein or have other things that might help to slow the absorption of those carbohydrates. But it's not the carbohydrates that are bad. So we don't need to cut those out. And anybody who is sharing that message really doesn't understand what's happening and is just looking at kind of the surface level information of how weight is regulated.
Yeah, it does feel like a little bit of a Band-Aid solution, just to tackle the weight loss. And again, like that doesn't even make sense if you can't keep it up. And we've seen in tons of research how, sustainable keto is typically one of the least sustainable diets out there. People just do not stay on it for very long, and you can imagine why, because it's kind of miserable to not ever have carbs again. Um, but it just seems like it
Absolutely.
is a backward suggestion in general, especially considering, we even have ample evidence that leaning towards more plant-based proteins over things like red meat is associated with fewer menopausal symptoms. And like you said, the heart health, the blood sugar regulation, so important to get that fiber in. We have research that carbs before bed can increase our deep REM sleep, reduce the time it takes to sleep. Like, why would we make things more miserable for ourselves by just not allowing ourselves the one part of the food component that has all of these benefits? So, oh,
And the pleasure of it.
yes,
I mean, what's better than
again.
bread? Who wants to live life without
100%. I
bread?
totally agree. And speaking of not having bread, back to the eating disorders thing, because I think a lot of folks think about eating disorders, disordered eating as being, a teens or early 20s problems. But menopause is another phase of life when we're just kind of like particularly susceptible to these hyper restrictive diets and behaviors. why is this just generally not a good time to be engaging in, whether it's keto or carnivore, intermittent fasting, like whatever it is, like why is this just not a good time to be engaging in extreme diets?